Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're really pleased to have two delegates from the House of Delegates with us this morning. Delegate Steve Landis, good to see you, sir.
Good to be here, Woody.
Delegate Ben Cline, good to see you.
Woody, great to be back.
A lot of changes in the House of Delegates this year, and I know both of you anticipated, like all Democrats did, that they would garner 15 more seats and upset the majority, so to speak.
Well, it was a surprise, but I don't think anybody predicted the wave that occurred in the election. But we still have 51 seats and are still in the majority and trying to do the people's business and trying to approach government in a common sense way and looking for solutions that everyday people are looking to seek redress from the General Assembly standpoint.
Well, congratulations to the both of you for surviving that wave. There have been other changes. I think the majority adopted some more transparency changes. Delegate Cline?
We did, and I was very pleased to see recorded votes in subcommittees for the first time on all votes. We've gotten used to the practice of voice votes on a lot of motions to table and in disposing of legislation, and I think it's important for transparency, and so citizens can hold their elected officials accountable to have those recorded votes. So putting those in the rules, that was a major victory.
So cameras in all the committee rooms now. You have to be careful about how you say things and how you look for fear of opposition research for your next re-election bid, I take it.
Well, that's been done for years privately, and so putting it on our cameras and having a more formal process is a good transition, and so we're continuing that tradition as well.
What about the tone overall in the House of Delegates? Has it changed as a result of the elections, you think?
Well, anytime you have a lot of new members, obviously that changes the body, and that's occurred a number of times since I've been here over 23 years now. So that always changes the tone a little bit. I think it takes new members just a little while to acclimate themselves to the process. One of the things that new members learn is that you don't always get your way. But that's true for every member. You have to build your support on pieces of legislation, and you have to get them out of committee or subcommittee first, then committee, and then on the floor of the House. And with the close numbers that we've got, both sides have to work together in a bipartisan manner to accomplish a lot of the more controversial things.
You're both members of the Conservative Caucus, and I understand there will be some announcements sometime today about your agenda.
There will be. I'm proud to co-chair the Conservative Caucus with Senator Mark Obenchain from Harrisonburg, and we have a good core group of conservatives who are interested in putting forward a positive agenda focused on economic initiatives, also social initiatives, and liberty, freedom initiatives. We'll be announcing our agenda this morning, and hopefully seeing a lot of those bills come to fruition, whether it's regulatory relief, reform of a lot of our programs related to occupational licensing reform, whether it comes to family legislation. Yes, we will have pro-life legislation as well. We will have Second Amendment legislation that we put forward as well as chairman of militia police. That's an important issue for me. And education reform that Delegate Landis is championing as well.
Talk to us a little bit about those reforms in education that you will be pursuing this session.
Woody, the first two or three bills that we have are related to protecting, House Bill 1 deals with protecting students' identity information in higher education. Right now, basically their personal information can be FOIA'd and provided to
Freedom
anybody.
of Information Act request.
Right, the Freedom of Information Act. So we're, Delegate Wilt's got a bill on that to basically make sure that students give permission if that information is going to be divulged or shared. Delegate Bell, Dickie Bell, has a bill related to teacher licensure, allowing military spouses that come into the state to be able to allow them a process where they can then get out in the classroom more quickly. That'll help both the teacher shortage issue and obviously military spouses that for our military personnel. Then I've got House Bill 3 that deals with setting a standard both for rigor and then also for the transfer credits for dual enrollment classes from higher education, from our for higher education related to our high schools where students are taking that, to make sure there's an assurance that parents know and students know that when they take the course, it's of a higher education level, but more importantly, they know exactly what the credit hours will be that will transfer towards their degree.
Well, does that also apply to community colleges, or does that only apply to institutions
It's
of higher
2- and
learning?
4-year institutions.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Talk to us a little bit about this court decision that recently came down, which was entitled the Incumbent Protection Act.
Well, that was a decision that was issued in response to a challenge from some local Republican units who were upset about the ability of incumbents to decide their method of nomination and wanted that decided by the district committees. And so it's the district court level. I think that the Attorney General is reviewing. I don't know what kind of decision they'll make about appealing or whether there's legislation in the General Assembly to address the issue. But I think it's a good decision in that it restores decision-making to the local committees, gives citizens the ability through their party structures to influence that method of nomination and returning control to the people. So that's
so were there only two options that an incumbent could invoke, either a primary election or one that was done by another means, I take it?
Well, there are several different methods. You can do a convention, a party caucus, a firehouse primary, a full primary, but that code section gave the incumbent the right to select that, and I think there's general agreement that that should be up to the party units to decide that method of nomination.
Militia, police, and public safety, pretty busy over the last few years. You also have a question of correctional officers who were here last week. I know that deals with appropriations as well, but I assume that you've heard from some correctional officers about the pay that they currently receive and the need for that pay to be increased.
Absolutely. Our corrections officers and our law enforcement officers do fantastic jobs, and we need to make sure that their pay is competitive and that they are paid a good amount. So working with appropriations, we're going to hopefully see some improvement there. We also are working on some reforms and making sure that as we continue to make reforms to our correctional institutions that we move the ball forward.
So I take it as Vice Chair of Appropriations, you'll be dealing with that issue among others this session as well.
Woody, we will. In fact, we had a presentation just the other day from the Director of the Department of Corrections. Our correctional officers are receiving about $1,000 to $4,000 less than most of our regional jails. And they have a similar job and responsibility. And we're going to have to do something to raise their pay. And in fact, most all other law enforcement officers, whether it's deputies or police officers or state troopers, are way above where they are. And we want to make sure that we have well-qualified individuals in our correctional facilities, but we also have to raise the pay and make sure the entry-level pay is there so it's competitive. And if we don't do that, they're already seeing a high turnover of correctional officers coming in and leaving and going to other, law enforcement positions, and we're not retaining or maintaining, the folks that we're training for those positions, and we've got to do something about that.
So we had the same situation last year with state highway patrolmen.
Yep.
And obviously that's something that was corrected last year. I assume this was anticipated, or was it not?
We've noticed that the change has occurred with correctional officers, but it's gotten more critical over the last 2 years. And obviously we did address state troopers and the compression and the salary issue and getting additional positions for the academies, but we're going to have to do a similar fashion address the correctional officers this year.
Militia, police, public safety, you have a lot of gun legislation before your committee from time to time. We've got the Heller decision that is at least 5 years old now, authored by Justice Scalia. It left a lot of questions open, however. What kind of legislation are you dealing with this year?
Well, there is legislation to codify that decision. That's in the Courts of Justice Committee. But there is a lot of legislation coming from some of the new members who are introducing concepts that have been in front of us before. Reinstating a 1 gun a month type of initiative, making sure that you have bans on certain kinds of firearms, or the ability to transfer firearms privately. Those have to go through mandatory background checks. Different kinds of bills that the Militia Police Committee has considered before, generally defeated over the last 15, 20 years, and has again decided that our current laws are appropriate. We are strong defenders of the Second Amendment here in Virginia, and we don't need additional gun control measures. So for the most part, in fact, completely, all of those gun control bills have died in the committee thus far.
Do you have any that you are pursuing in committee? I think I read about one dealing with open carry equaling concealed carry, so to speak. I'm just trying to compress the concept.
It's called constitutional carry,
okay,
which essentially says that the only permission that you need to carry concealed is the Constitution. You don't need a permit from a clerk or government or a judge to carry concealed. That's the goal, and many other states do have that. And so that bill I introduced last year, it passed out of militia police, and because it removes the fee revenue that the state police receives for the permits, it was considered by appropriations, and because it had a fiscal impact, did not pass out of appropriations. So we're hoping that with some new revenues, we might be able to afford it this year, but the militia police will probably take that up in subcommittee on Thursday.
Great, great. School discipline. There's been a lot of talk about that over the last few years. There are some bills that have been introduced to deal with that, especially at the level of K through 3rd grade. Talk to us about how the problem was initiated and how we're going to resolve it.
Well, Woody, we've had a lot of legislation in the last couple of years. I know Delegate Bell, actually Delegate Bourne has legislation this year.
He's one of the new members, correct?
One of the newer members, not a brand new member,
right,
but he has legislation that is somewhat of a compromise. Actually, Subcommittee on Education just heard this the other day. It'll be coming to the full Education Committee, I think, this week. And what it basically does is say that there be a limit on 45 days that a student could be suspended.
That's quite a long time.
That's still a long time. What's happening in elementary schools is there's no alternatives for young people. When you get to middle and high school, there are alternative programs. So individuals on long-term suspension or that have, coming in and off of expulsion or suspension can have educational opportunities. In elementary school, that's much more difficult, and we're having more and more elementary school students that are being expelled or suspended. It's a behavioral issue problem for our schools, so we're trying to balance giving our local school system and the principal and the teachers some control of their classroom and their school, but at the same time not just allow a child to be suspended for up to 365 days out of the school year, or not have any really educational opportunities. So we're trying to find that balance between, again, local control, local school control, and making sure that students are not just being suspended for a longer period of time than needs to be.
What are some of the offenses that these children are being suspended for?
They can be anything from a violation of school policy that parents and students are supposed to be aware of, to very bad behaviors in even elementary school, unfortunately. And I think nobody wants to have a student in the classroom being disruptive to other
Right.
students. So we're trying to make sure that the bad actors are being punished appropriately, and those that may be just having some behavioral issues. And sometimes with young students, Woody, we don't know what other things are going on,
Right,
things
right.
that may not have been diagnosed. There may be behavioral health issues, mental health issues that sometimes are just not aware either of the parents or the school system until really we find out kind of what's going on with that young person.
Now, you mentioned lack of resources equating to lack of alternatives at that level. Is it going to be additional monies to school districts to deal with that issue as well?
Well, that's something that we're going to have to address, but right now that's pretty much up to the local school systems. The state does provide some assistance with that. But I think we need to look at it on a regional basis and make sure that regionally school systems not only provide this for middle and high school students, but they need to be looking at what are they going to provide for elementary school students as well. And they might be able to dovetail with programs that are at least in the same location, obviously different instructional personnel. But again, you have to have somebody there to
Right,
provide that.
right.
So you're either taking a teacher out of the classroom and putting them in that position, or you're hiring additional personnel to accomplish that.
You have some legislation dealing with income taxes and the marginal tax rate in terms of reducing that, correct?
I do. The economy is turning around, and we want to make sure that citizens benefit from that improved economy. So reducing the income tax will not only help return some of that revenue to the citizens, but also spur economic growth in Virginia. And when most of our small businesses operate under the LLC, limited liability corporation format, where they pay their individual income tax rate on their businesses, lowering that rate will help those businesses reinvest and hire and expand. So it's a great small business bill. It is expensive to eliminate the entire top 5.75% income tax rate, and that just lowers the top rate to 5%. But I'm definitely willing to meet in the middle, and where our policymakers and our leadership are willing to adjust it, I'm willing to talk about that.
So the recent tax reform matter that was passed in Washington, D.C. will have a significant impact on what we do here. You're on the Finance Committee. I assume there have been discussions about that. Can you give us a little background about what's going on and some of the dialogue that's occurring?
Well, we're looking at revenues that are coming in, the impact of the tax bill on those revenues, which is positive, but also how Virginia needs to adjust its income tax, well, its entire tax code,
Right.
to adjust for the new tax bill. That's a complex process, and right now we're trying to anticipate what the federal tax changes are going to do to Virginia in terms of revenues without even touching the state tax code, and then we're going to need to make adjustments to the state tax code to account for what happened in Washington. We want to complement what's happened in Washington, build on what's happened in Washington, do our own tax reform, so to speak, so that Virginia can remain atop the rankings of places to do business.
I know as Vice Chair of Appropriations, you're working closely with Chris Jones and the other members of the committee to deal with that issue as well. It is complicated, but I know you had a presentation recently about that. We
did. Secretary Aubrey Lane reviewed really where the federal law does impact Virginia, potentially impacts Virginia. And as Ben said, we're looking, the Department of Taxation, we'll work with the House Finance Committee and then the Senate Finance Committee. But we're suggesting that we come back in September, October timeframe in the fall, looking at special sessions so that we can update the Virginia tax code based on what we find from the Department of Taxation, because it's going to have an impact on revenue. And at this point, it looks like we would have a windfall from the standpoint of the state, but that also means that our taxpayers will be paying more in state taxes. So I think we're going to have to look at how we can adjust that and make sure it makes sense both from an economic standpoint and then also what's fair for our citizens.
Of course, that's a positive thing that's come out of Washington. We had a weekend shutdown just a couple of weeks ago. We're facing another one come February 8th. What kind of impact does that uncertainty especially have on the state of Virginia?
Well, obviously the state, just like any state, receives federal dollars for many, many programs. So we have to kind of plan for that, or at least anticipate that it can impact our budget. Obviously the federal government doesn't make good on its promises to fund certain things. That's kind of the discussion we have about Medicaid expansion, whether they're going to have the funds long term to provide to the states. But in the short term, that's even more important because we have planned for those funds to be there. So if they shut the government down or are not providing those funds. Now generally what Congress does and the President does is they go back and retroactively fund those things that weren't funded while they were actually had the government shut down. They didn't have what they call a continuing resolution to keep the government operating.
Now you have some federal employees, I take it, in your district are federal contractors, and they are all impacted by what happens in Washington, D.C. as well. Talk to us about those constituents and their needs and concerns.
Well, everybody's impacted by the federal government and the lack of ability of the federal government to work in an orderly manner. D.C. is broken, fundamentally broken, and it needs leadership. It needs common sense conservative policies like those that we have out in the Valley to kind of break the cycle of inefficiency and just stop and go governance to put us back on the right track. So hopefully we'll see an improvement over the next few years where with the improving economy and with some of the turnover in government, we'll see us set on the right path.
Talk to us a little bit more about what's happening in the Valley economically. Who are the major employers? What do you anticipate in terms of attracting new businesses, sustaining the ones that are there?
Well, our districts are close to each other in the Valley. We're in the central part of the Valley. Agriculture is our biggest industry, so a lot of poultry and beef cattle, dairy, so, but also other kinds of agriculture, turkeys. And what we need to do is to continue to support agriculture in the Valley. In addition, we have a diverse group of manufacturers throughout the Valley. I represent Stewart's Draft, which has a Coors facility, a Hershey facility, a Little Debbie facility. It's a tasty place. But so the Valley is very diverse, and we want to encourage that continued diverse growth.
Delegate Danny Marshall was in here, and he had to remind me that agriculture and forestry is the biggest revenue producer for the Commonwealth.
It is, Woody. $91 billion that the state benefits from, and it's so diverse. And that's the thing, as Ben was mentioning, there's various aspects of agriculture that we have in the Valley, but across the Commonwealth. That diversity has helped us from a stabilization standpoint with our economy over